What if it were possible to eliminate most of society's chronic disease, like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, through basic changes to the way we live? My guest today, Dr. David L. Katz, believes that it is possible, and he has the research to back it up. Dr. Katz has specialized in internal medicine, preventive medicine, and public health, and in lifestyle medicine. And he has a particular expertise in nutrition, which is what we'll focus on today. Based on the world's healthiest people, what are the essential elements of a healthy diet? We'll probe these and other questions today. Welcome to Vital Signs, Dr. Katz. So great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Great to be with you.
Really looking forward to getting your insights on what we can eat for better health. And I'm particularly pleased that you're staying on for this live Q&A that's going to start at 2 p.m. Viewers, at 2 o'clock, we'll have a live Q&A session with Dr. Katz. So if you have a question you'd like answered, you can submit it by clicking on the yellow bar just below the screen. If you're watching on a social media platform, you can join us on the Epoch Health platform to submit your questions directly. Just look for the link that will take you to the Epoch Times website in the description. Okay, let's get started. Dr. Katz, you've said that virtually 80% of society's chronic disease could be eliminated. In a nutshell, how could that be achieved?
Well, first thing, Brendan, it's important, as you said at the start, to have evidence behind this. So this is not just my opinion. In fact, the evidence on this very topic changed the entire arc of my career, because I finished my training in internal medicine in 1991, went immediately into a second residency in preventive medicine public health at Yale, and I completed that in 1993. And within weeks to at most a couple of months of my completion of that second residency, a research paper came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled Actual Causes of Death in the United States. Provocative title, right? It certainly caught my attention, and I'll spare you and listeners the ways that it changed my career, but it gets right at this question. What do we need to do to eliminate 80% of chronic disease and premature death in the world around us? What do we need to do to reduce our personal risk of premature death from almost any cause of chronic disease by 80%? Well, this paper began to answer that question, because when they looked for the actual causes of death, they were talking about the root causes. So for example, if someone dies in the hospital of heart failure, secondary to heart attack, that may be all the information that's listed on a death certificate. But it leaves you wanting to know what caused the heart attack. And if the answer to that is atherosclerosis of the coronary arteries, then it leaves you wanting to know, well, but what caused the atherosclerosis to form in the first place, right? So that's what these authors did. They dug down to get at these root causes. And when they were done, they had enumerated a list of 10 factors, which altogether explained almost all of the premature deaths that occur in the country every year, and most of the chronic disease. What grabbed my attention as a newly minted preventive medicine specialist with a particular interest in nutrition and lifestyle was the first 3 factors, all by themselves, accounted for 80% of the burden. There's that figure we're talking about. 80% of premature death, 80% of chronic disease were attributable to tobacco, poor diet, and lack of physical activity. I've called them bad use of feet, forks, and fingers. So 80% of the risk for premature death and chronic disease. And there is an abundant literature ever since that has looked at this from both sides. So what happens if you have risk factors, if you smoke, if you eat badly, if you're inactive? But what also happens on the flip side of that coin, if you get it right? What if you don't smoke, you eat optimally, real food, mostly plants, and we'll obviously spend some time getting into that formula, and are physically active on a regular basis? And the answer is, over any period of time that's been studied, your risk of developing any major chronic disease relative to the population at large goes down roughly 80%. Before we leave this topic, and I know we've got lots of ground to cover, I just want to make sure everybody listening feels this. One of the problems with public health, and I say this as a public health physician who's devoted my career to this space, is that the public is a fiction. There is no public. There's you, there's me, there's everybody else, there are families, the people we're connected to, people we love. The public is an anonymous mass that doesn't really exist. And the
Like an
problem with it is,
abstraction, an abstraction.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, it basically, behind the veil of the public is lots of real people. But because of the veil, it's a statistical, anonymous mass that doesn't make us feel anything. And that's a real problem because when we improve public health, it transforms lives of people we love, lives that change the way our own lives feel, and maybe changes our own lives directly. So it's really important to part the veil of statistical anonymity and make sure that when we talk about massive improvements in public health, 80% less premature death and chronic disease, we all appreciate what that would feel like. So everybody watching this, think about the people you love and think about whether someone you love has been affected by heart disease or cancer or stroke or diabetes or dementia. And think about the challenges of dealing with that. Think about how harsh it was to get that news. And now imagine a world where 8 times in 10, that news never came. That bad day never happened. You never got the call about the trip to the hospital or the ICU or the emergency room or the doctor. Never got the bad test result because so much of it has gone away. We're really talking about a tremendous addition of years to life and life to years that makes our experience richer and better and protects the people we love. So it's that simple. Frankly, avoid tobacco, eat optimally, be physically active. There are other things we can get into as well that complete the formula, but that
Of
is
those, Dr.
associated.
Katz, you mentioned avoiding tobacco, eating well, doing exercise. I imagine there's a few other there as well.
Yeah,
What would diet represent of that? How important is diet in that scheme of things?
yeah. Well, so when this paper came out in 1993, it was number 2 on the list of causal factors. Tobacco was number
Wow.
1. Poor diet was the second leading cause of premature death, chronic disease. In the years since, it has become number 1. Diet quality measured objectively is today the single leading predictor variable for premature death and chronic disease in the modern world. So this would be true in all industrialized countries. Number
That
1.
that is staggering to hear. And I know
It is. Yeah.
I know you refer to it as like the blood pressure cuff of this period of time for its
Yeah. So
significance as a vital sign in determining what our risk of disease is. In this, I know that your focus is very much on health and lifestyle, on diet and lifestyle, Dr. Katz. What about DNA? How much does a person's the factors that are out of control for a person, what they're born with, how much does that factor in to a person's health?
important, obviously, but DNA is not destiny, and dinner, to a much greater extent, is. So there's the very occasional, very rare disease where a specific genetic mutation actually causes the disease. Most people probably have heard of Huntington's disease. It's a genetically dominant disease where a mutation means you're going to get the disease, and it's a tragic condition. It shortens lifespan. It's on a very, very short list, and that's why everybody's heard of Huntington's disease, because it's basically an exception that we trot out to help establish the rule that most of the time DNA is not destiny. And there are good reasons for that, Brendan. 95% of our chromosomal real estate is not genes. 95% of our chromosomal real estate is what's called the epigenome. It's the spaces around genes, and those spaces are populated by what we might think of as molecular levers and switches that dictate what the genes do. And studies show that even people with very high genetic risk for a given condition can change their outcome, can change whether or not they get that condition. Let's take heart disease as an example, by behaviors that reset the levers and switches of the epigenome. So that's called epigenetics. So we can't change the genes we have, but we absolutely can change what the genes we have do. And the single leading determinant of what our genes do is what we do. Lifestyle behaviors can massively alter the settings of the epigenome. And what this results in is you could have genes that do, if you will, bad things, increase your risk, say, for heart disease or heart attack. You can turn those genes off. So whatever they were contributing to the bloodstream that elevated your risk of heart disease goes away. And there are genes that are protective, cancer suppressor genes, for example. And there are studies that show that lifestyle interventions turn those genes on.
It's
So
a
this
very
is why
encouraging message.
absolutely DNA is not destiny, but dinner is. So on the one hand, tremendous opportunity for all of us to have more years in life, more life in years. But along with that power comes the responsibility to say, okay, so what I do really matters. I have to take it very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very hopeful message, because you may look at your parents and look at the kinds of, they might have suffered a particular type of cancer, they might have diabetes, and it's not necessarily something that you have to experience yourself. You have some control over that through the way that you live. We'll hear more from Dr. Katz in just a second. Just want to leave this message for our viewers. Many of you out there have asked if live broadcasts like this one can be replayed later. I'm pleased to say yes, they can. Subscribers to Epoch Health or Epoch TV can replay for free. If you're not a subscriber, you're in luck, because there's a risk-free trial subscription for a year on offer at the moment. So that's a chance to experience traditional journalism along with getting cutting-edge health insights. Now, Dr. Katz, I want to go a bit further into what the essentials of a good diet look like. Speaking in broad terms, what are the main types of food that should be in our diets?
Mostly vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts and seeds, and plain water when thirsty. So Michael Pollan, nutrition and science writer, famously said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, a 7-word summary.
It can't be that simple, sure.
And it is. And it makes sense that it's that simple. Now, of course, simple isn't easy, meaning, yeah, the prescription's quite simple, but doing it in the modern world is not easy. So we'll talk about that, right? You have to get there from here. And of course, you need a lot more detail. Okay, so vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. What do I do with them all? What are my meals? How do I turn that into a menu plan? And what about the other stuff? Can I eat fish? Can I eat seafood? Can I eat meat? Can I eat poultry? Can I eat dairy? Can I eat eggs? So we can get into all of that. But it actually is that simple. And Brendan, I think in some ways it's almost self-evident that it should be simple. Why? Well, because Homo sapiens is a kind of animal, like every other kind of animal on the planet. And you think about any species other than ours. Think about giraffes and zebras and dolphins and lions and tigers and bears and koalas and whatever you want. But we simply accept the fact that there's a particular way that kind of animal is adapted to eat, and that eating the way they're adapted is going to work for them, and almost anything else won't. So we expect that the wildebeest are going to eat grass and the lions are going to eat the wildebeest. And when we put animals in a zoo, we don't run randomized controlled trials to figure out what to feed them. We don't try the lions on grass and the wildebeest on meat. We accept the fact that it's pretty obvious what kind of animal they are, what they were eating in the wild, and what they ought to eat. Well, it's one of the things we overlook about ourselves. We have adaptations to a particular kind of diet. We come from historical origins where all food came to us direct from nature. We ate a wide variety of wild plant foods and the animal foods that we could hunt. Dairy was not a part of our diet prehistorically. Grains were a limited part of our diet prehistorically. Beans were a limited part of our diet prehistorically. So is wild game and lots of wild plants, both fruits and vegetables and tubers. So real food, not too much, mostly plants, actually takes us in the direction of our native adaptations. And now we have to build out all the details. And the other thing that's important about us is we're not like every other kind of animal, are we? We have culture. And culture gives us all these different practices around the world, different preferences, different upbringing. So can we take the same common foundations, a fundamentally healthy approach to diet, and then customize it culturally, personalize it so it satisfies the way we want to live and eat as individuals? Absolutely, yes. So you're right. In a sense, it's not that simple. There's a lot more to talk about, but the fundamental formula is simple. And frankly, that's refreshing and liberating, because that fundamental truth, Eat food, not too much, mostly plants, mostly vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and plain water when thirsty. If you get that right, you can't go too far wrong. And that doesn't change with every study. That doesn't change with every news cycle. It's stable, reliable news, if you will, about diet that you really can trust and rely on for a lifetime.
It is reassuring. And I think that's what I really appreciate in what I've read of your work, Dr. Katz. I know that you try to cut through the confusion of these competing messages about diet, and essentially we can look at what makes people healthy. We look at the populations where people are healthier, and these are pretty good indications of what we should be eating, and we'll get into that in just a moment. I just want to go back a little bit, and you said the term real food and whole food. What do we mean when we're talking about a real food?
Well, that comes directly from Michael Pollan's quote, eat food. And so we translate that to real food. And really what that means is food where the ingredients are all from nature and familiar. You could argue that the best example of real food has an ingredient list 1 word long. So a banana, an apple, an orange, broccoli, almonds, walnuts, salmon, these are just foods that come to us direct from nature, and
Without too
nothing is
much processing.
yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the processing is just sort of moving them through the system so they get from where they started to our kitchen table. But right, more often than not, nothing is added, nothing is taken away. But we could go beyond that. So, for example, I think it would be fair to say that steel cut oats or ground whole wheat flour are still in the realm of real food, even though the flour has been ground from the wheat and the oats have been cut and pressed. So they're not exactly in the form that they were in nature. There's a little bit of processing, if you will, but that's not bad. But what real food really differentiates itself from is pseudo food, frankenfood, junk where food ought to be. And there's an awful lot of that. And so that would be food put together with ingredients we don't even recognize as food. And a lot of the food coming to us from big manufacturers is what is now referred to as ultra processed. And if you look at the ingredient list on a package, sort of runs off the page. There are all sorts of chemical names. There are texturizers and emulsifiers and artificial colors and artificial flavors. And
You don't
that's not
expect to understand what any of these things are. We don't have that expectation of actually understanding what's in these foods.
That's right. And well, the one thing you do know for sure is it's not food. It looks like a chemistry experiment, and that's really it's not experimental in the sense that they know what effect it's going to have on us. And a quick aside, and this is why this topic, and we can dive in further, is important. Ultra processed food is not ultra processed by accident. It's ultra processed by design to maximize the calories it takes to feel full. There's work in this area by many, but the one that I like best is Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist Michael Moss. He's the author of 2 great books on the topic, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked. He wrote a New York Times Magazine cover story entitled The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food, and it tells the story. So ultra processing is not our friend, because more often than not, it's in the service of what do we put together in this food? What chemicals do we use? What stimulants of the appetite center do we put in here? So it's nearly impossible to stop eating this because, yeah, I mean, the person eating it's probably going to develop obesity and maybe get sick, but we're going to sell more and we're going to profit more. And so we win. And yeah, they win, but you lose. And so when you move in the direction of real food, short ingredient lists, where everything that's in the food you're eating is recognizable as a food, there are many virtues for your health, but among them is it minimizes the calories it takes to feel full. You're just much less likely to struggle with weight control when you move in the direction of foods direct from nature.
That makes sense. And yes, it is mind-boggling and a bit concerning to think about the kind of motivations behind where a lot of this processed food is coming from, because our nutrition is largely not the motive there. With one thing I'm very interested to know about, Dr. Katz, there's been this whole movement for raw food, and the meaning there, the implicit meaning is that by cooking food, we're taking away some of its nutritional value. Is that the case, or do we need to eat food in its rawest form to get the full benefit from it?
So the best answer, Brendan, is it depends. But I think to quickly suppress the myth that raw food is better, I'll give you the answer that we really need here, the reality check. No, it's not true. And the reason it's not true is because in some cases you actually enhance the nutritional properties of food with cooking. I'll give you two important examples. One, the compound in tomatoes that makes them red, lycopene, it's a type of carotenoid. It's an antioxidant compound. And it's been associated with better prostate health, lower risk of prostate cancer. It's good for the cardiovascular system. It's good for the eyes. There are all sorts of health benefits attached to lycopene. The lycopene is fat soluble. And so there's very little fat in a tomato. So it's pretty hard if you eat raw tomatoes for the human body to access this very valuable nutrient. If you make tomato sauce, where you mix tomatoes with extra virgin olive oil, the lycopene basically blends with the oil and becomes much more what we call bioavailable. The human body can make better use of it. So lycopene levels go up much more when you eat cooked tomatoes, particularly if you combine them with an ingredient like extra virgin olive oil, than when you eat raw tomatoes. Now, that's just an example, but it's a nice example. That doesn't mean don't eat raw tomatoes, by the way. That's also perfectly good, but it just proves the point that cooking doesn't necessarily interfere with access to really important nutrients. Sometimes it can enhance it. And then there's another really important example, and this may have been something you want to talk about anyway, Brendan, and that's this issue of lectins. A case was made that because lectins are widespread in certain foods, including lots of vegetables, many fruits, whole grains, beans, and lentils, that these foods are potentially bad for us. And that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the single most predominant commonality among the world's blue zone populations in terms of diet. So the blue zones, for those who don't know, are the places around the world discovered by National Geographic fellow Dan Buettner, where people most routinely live to be 100 and don't get chronic disease. It's what we all want, a long, vital, healthy life. They don't get chronic disease. They don't get dementia. They stay strong and vital right up till the end, and then they die peacefully in their sleep more often than not. These are blessings.
And these are all fantastic tourist destinations as well.
Well, exactly.
The places you want to be.
That's right. Exactly. Ikaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Okinawa, Japan, Loma Linda, California, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. Yeah, nice places to visit too, and pick up some tips about how to eat and live while you're there. But beans are the staple that runs through these 5 very diverse populations, very diverse diets. So when Dan Buettner, who discovered the blue zones, talks about what's the single most important dietary practice, it would be legumes, beans, and lentils. And these are naturally rich in lectins. But 2 things about lectins. First, there's a pretty significant literature that some lectins actually are beneficial, that they inhibit cancer. So the idea that lectins are harmful is misguided. It's like any large family of compounds. Sometimes they could be in certain quantities, but more often than not, there are hints that they're potentially helpful. But the other thing is their activity is inhibited with cooking. So yeah, eating raw lentils or raw beans, not a great idea. But the way they're cooked in almost any culture reduces the activity of the lectins to a negligible level. And so you derive all the tremendous health benefits of eating beans and lentils. And this concern about what could be an anti-nutrient goes away. So cooking can both enhance our access to valuable nutrients like lycopene, or it can inhibit or deactivate select anti-nutrients. So that's why the answer, is it good to eat everything raw, is no. But there are many fruits, for example, and many vegetables that really are very good for us raw. And sometimes when you cook them, you do reduce certain fragile nutrient levels, antioxidants, for instance. So cooking isn't always better, and raw is not always better. So what I would say is avoid dogma. Take dogma off the idea that there's just one way to do everything and it's always right. Usually when you hear that, you should step away from your credit card. Usually somebody's trying to sell you something. So it's just not true. So raw is sometimes better, but often not.
Okay. The, the alarm bells should go off when we hear the absolutist messages with so many
Yeah.
things that we encounter coming thrown at us from social media and various marketing sources. Also, with that, Dr. Katz, people also can suffer bloating, and they can get gas from eating eating beans, eating lentils, and things like that. Do you have a way around that?
Yeah, yeah. So it tends to be related to some proteins in beans and lentils that can be a little difficult to digest, mostly for people who aren't accustomed to eating them. So the first tip would be, if you don't have a diet that's rich in these really valuable foods, again, the staples of the blue zones, they're really good for you. They're also really good for the environment. Plants that grow beans and lentils for us tend to be very hardy, drought resistant, heat resistant, pest resistant. In a world where the climate's changing and it's going to be hard to have high quality food for everybody, they're going to help us a lot. They have a really low carbon footprint. Everything about them is great. But if you're not used to eating them, take a little time to adapt. One of the things that determines whether you have bloating or whether you digest beans without a problem is your microbiome. And what changes your microbiome is what you're eating. So if you have a microbiome that's adapted to a diet without beans and suddenly put beans in the system, you're not going to have the right microbiome to help you digest this well. And you're going to have some gastrointestinal issues. So I would say gradually build up, make incremental changes to your diet, give your system time to catch up. So, you add beans or lentils a meal or two a week at first, and little by little build up so it becomes a routine part of, let's say, your daily routine. It's a routine part of my daily routine. There are also, for those who need it, there are products like Beano, which basically provides supportive enzymes to help break down these challenging proteins in beans. And then finally, using traditional recipes to cook beans and lentils. There, in the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, North Africa. I mean, there are lots of fabulous recipes that use
India.
lentils. In India, if you use these, the combinations of ingredients in these traditional recipes tends to facilitate digestion as well. They're cooked
Fascinating.
optimally. Yeah, so incrementally build up. If you need enzyme support, it's available in commercial products. And turn to traditional recipes because they figured out over many generations the ideal ways to cook beans and to combine them with other ingredients to make them much easier to digest. And so you can have all the benefits for your health and vitality and for the planet for that matter, and none of that difficulty.
There's a reason why these people have eaten this way for sometimes thousands of years. It's not just because they've developed great tasting food. There's also a certain health benefit to it. Now, I'd like to move into fruits and vegetables specifically with you, Dr. Katz. We all know we should eat fruits and vegetables. I think everyone understands this. But there's so much concern out there about pesticides and other toxins, and it seems almost like we need to eat organic and pay the cost associated with that if we want to contemplate eating fruits and vegetables. Is that the truth, or are we being more concerned than we have to be?
Yeah. So again, the simple answer is no, it's not the truth. And what I mean by that is we have a vast amount of scientific literature indicating that, other things being equal, people who eat more fruits and vegetables do better. They do better across almost any measure. So less heart disease, less diabetes, less obesity, less degenerative arthritis, less cancer, less dementia, all the bad stuff, less inflammatory disease, better responses to infection, including COVID, SARS-CoV-2, on and on it goes. And those studies, those vast studies across many populations and many years and many types of research methodologies, have not been limited to organic produce because most people are not eating organic produce. In other words, the net benefit from eating more fruits and vegetables is perfectly clear when those fruits and vegetables are conventionally grown, when pesticides and herbicides are used. Now, is that a carte blanche for pesticides and herbicides? Absolutely not. Would we be better off avoiding them? Almost certainly, yes. It's pretty hard, by the way, to identify the specific harms of trace residual amounts of something on a food that you're trying really hard to get off your food. So if you buy produce and you rinse it, if you clean your lettuce, if you clean your berries, it's really hard to know how much was your exposure to a residual herbicide, say. And similarly, people who are eating organic are not perfectly shielded from these compounds because they can get into the groundwater. And so, there's less exposure, but it's not zero. So it's very hard to say exactly what the harms are, but it just stands to reason that these chemicals designed to kill either insects or other plants are probably not a great part of the human diet. And we have some clues that that's the case. And we certainly know it's better for the planet to avoid them. So if you can find and afford organic produce, it's a great thing to do, certainly for the planet, probably for your health. There's a list that comes out every year. You can just Google this, called the Dirty Dozen, which is the most recent evidence from the Environmental Working Group indicating which 12 fruits and vegetables have the highest residual amounts of pesticide and herbicide because of the way they're grown. And as you might suspect, inevitably, it's foods that you eat skin and all. So, for example, you don't need to worry much about a banana or an orange because you take the whole surface off. But when you eat the whole surface, like a strawberry or a peach, it's a much bigger issue. And you can rinse those pretty thoroughly and eliminate nearly all of the problems. So that's what I'd recommend. If you can't routinely find or can't routinely afford organic produce, are you still better off eating fruits and vegetables routinely? Absolutely yes. Should you rinse and clean that before you eat it? Absolutely yes. And should you pay particular attention to doing that when it's a food that you eat in its entirety as opposed to one you peel? Yes, but it's really that simple.
And just quickly, is there a particular substance that should be used for rinsing? Is water generally sufficient? Or?
Generally, yes. Sometimes if you feel a waxy compound on the surface of, say, an apple, I've been tempted to say, because some of those compounds may not be water soluble. So every now and then I'll get an apple and I'll feel that it's coated in wax. I don't like that. I want I want to get down to the apple. So I will use a simple dish soap that's right at the sink, and I'll wash it and then rinse it thoroughly. But most of the time, water, you'll remember this from probably, was it high school chemistry or some middle school, is the universal solvent. It's pretty good. So for most of the compounds we're concerned about, yeah, just a thorough rinsing with water will do the job.
That's what I'm doing with my blueberries at the moment. It breaks my heart that they are included, at the top of that
They
30
are.
dozen list.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I eat blueberries almost every day, organic when I can, but sometimes they're not available. So then I get conventionally grown blueberries and I just rinse them thoroughly with water.
Okay, well, that gives me quite a lot of reassurance, Dr. Katz. Now, I'd like to go into, this is another focus of a lot of myth, I imagine, and a lot of controversy, the whole carbs and bread issue. It seems that carbs have been villainized to an incredible degree in recent decades. Are they really the bad guy that we've been led to believe?
Well, first of all, if we use the right meaning of carbohydrate, Brendan, then the answer is definitely no, because every plant food is carbohydrate. Many plant foods are just about all carbohydrate. And I'm talking about vegetables and fruits. So some of the best foods, the foods we've been talking about all along as the best foods, beans, lentils, and almost all plant foods are a significant carbohydrate source. So saying carbohydrate is bad would be like saying, okay, so fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds are bad. Well, that's the entire portfolio I just recommended for a healthy diet. That doesn't make sense. So what we really need to be talking about is bad actors. And are there bad actors in the carbohydrate family? And carbohydrate, by the way, if you think about that word, carbohydrate. So carbo means carbon, hydrate means water. These are compounds that have a label in common because they have a molecular structure in common. That's all. They're basically a long string of hydrated carbon. So essentially water molecules attached to carbon molecules. That's how these things are put together. That's all carbohydrate means. Yeah, we've simplified it, said carbs means bad. That's just silly. Lentils are a source of carbohydrate. They are arguably just about the most nutritious food you could possibly eat, associated with less risk of obesity, less risk of diabetes, fantastic nutrition, high in fiber, high in high quality protein, on and on it goes. But lollipops are also a source of carbohydrate. Not so good, right? So are we really saying lentils and lollipops are the same? Are we really saying that jelly beans and pinto beans are the same? They're not. So we really need to be more specific. And I would discourage talking about nutrients, carbs, protein, fat. We should instead be talking about foods, because then we all really know what we mean. Vegetables, good for us. Fruits, good for us. Whole grains, good for us. Added sugar, not good for us. Refined white flour, not good for us. Ultra processed food with long chemical ingredient list, not good for us. So then it becomes perfectly clear. I should be eating more of this if I want to be healthy. I should be eating less of that, as opposed to a one size fits all summary label that has just about zero meaning, carbohydrate. And to be clear, the other thing, Brendan, just, because these are, there's a famous expression, those who don't learn from the follies of history are destined to repeat them.
So
And,
true.
yeah, so that the whole let's vilify carbohydrate era, partly it was courtesy of Dr. Robert Atkins, who has an interesting history. He first introduced this concept in the 1970s, brought it back in the 1990s, and it's here again today as the ketogenic diet, which is pretty much what Atkins was doing. But when we really fell in love with cutting carbs, it was reactionary to the fact that we had recently fallen in love with cutting fat out of our diet. We made the same mistake there.
Mm.
Summary judgment, all fat is bad fat, including avocado and walnuts and almonds and extra virgin olive. We were wrong. We threw out the baby with the bathwater, and we basically replaced some very good foods with very bad foods and loaded up on things like Snackwell cookies and added sugar, and we got fatter and sicker. So
Mm.
instead of saying, okay, maybe we shouldn't just jettison a whole nutrient category, we should think more about what foods we're eating. No, we just made the same mistake in a new direction. We said, okay, so it's not fat. Let's do it again with carbohydrate, and let's throw out the baby with the bathwater again. So I just think it's the wrong way to think about food and health.
Yeah, definitely a pattern there. Fats, carbohydrates, could be protein next, and I'm
Well,
sure
no,
that
it
the
won't. It
warning
won't be
bells have to
protein
go
because
off.
it won't be protein because we've gone the other way with protein, and instead of vilifying it, we've canonized it. So people have the misguided notion that protein is the saint of the food world, and the more the
Uh-huh.
better. And that's also wrong, by the way. But we have done it with other things than fat and carbohydrate. We did it with the glycemic index. We did it with gluten. We've done it with lectins. So we've done it with fructose. I mean, so basically people are always looking for a scapegoat. What's the one thing I can blame all my dietary troubles on? But what really matters is the overall dietary pattern, the overall quality of your diet.
Mm.
So it's about a wholesome assembly of wholesome foods, balanced assembly of wholesome foods. And there isn't a single silver bullet, and there isn't a single scapegoat.
I think you've probably broadened many people's concept of what carbohydrates include. If there was a common bad guy that is used to brand the bad carb, it would be bread. This is something that if you're trying to lose weight, you're trying to maintain health, you don't want to be eating too much bread is the general understanding. But I've seen videos of yours, Dr. Katz, where you are eating bread, which is quite surprising to me. So what is the deal with bread? Is there a kind of, I think this was whole grain bread. So is this an exception? Is it okay to eat that?
First of all, a really good bread is one of life's great pleasures, right? I mean, if you haven't visited a great boulangerie in France, you're really missing out. Let's just be clear. And let's digress for just a second, Brendan. I promise I'll answer your question about bread and its role in my life. But friends, let's think for a minute. What is health for? Health is not so you can tick a box that says I was virtuous. Health is not something you do because somebody like me is wagging a finger at you. Health is for fun. Healthy people have more fun. Life is better. If other things being equal, healthy versus not means better life. You can do the things you love to do. Well, really great food that we eat just for the pleasure, is also about having a better life. It's a big part of our lives. We all eat every day. We all have a really important relationship with food. I think there is a balance to be struck between the pleasure we get from good health and the pleasure we get from good food. And we really shouldn't have to trade one off against the other. So my diet, I practice what I preach. I eat an optimal diet that's real food, mostly plants. It's just what we've been talking about. But I include in that foods that I love. I love a great bread. And typically it's a whole grain bread. So yes, that is an exception, because with whole grain, intact whole grain, you have high levels of fiber. And what you're really concerned about with bread is that it would be refined carbohydrates, so white flour, which would have a high glycemic index. It would bump up your blood sugar. It would stimulate an insulin release. It would cause inflammation, contribute to weight gain. But whole grain bread doesn't have those liabilities because the fiber actually blunts the glycemic response, lowers insulin requirements, is good for the microbiome, and on it goes. The other thing is, as we think about the trouble we're in the modern world, where poor diet quality is the number one killer, really, bread can't be the explanation. Maybe bad bread can be, maybe ultra processed bread can be, but bread in general, because bread goes back to the dawn of civilization. Bread was a staple in Mesopotamia. Bread was a staple in Egypt. They were using wheat and barley. These have been parts of the human diet since anybody's been keeping records. And we didn't have epidemic obesity and diabetes, even though all those different ages of human civilization routinely ate bread. So we've changed what we put in the bread. That's a problem. We've gone from whole grain flour to refined flour most of the time. That's a problem. But bread per se is not the problem. And whether it's something that you find at a market or something you learn how to make, there are lots of variations on the theme of whole grain bread, which allows you to have this delicious thing that's been a huge part of the human experience. In fact, Brendan, such a huge part of the human experience, it's something we refer to. We talk about breaking bread together as a way of celebrating our human connection. I mean, that's the expression, because that's what humans did. I mean, if you welcomed a stranger into your house over all the ages of human civilization, you shared bread. It meant you were sharing your heart and sharing your home. So it's been an important part of who and what we are. I don't think we have to give that up, but I think we want to preserve what makes bread a healthy part of a delightful diet, and that's the kind of bread I eat routinely. So give me a really good whole grain bread any day. That said,
specific
that's
type. If people, you said
specific grain.
Yeah.
It depends on your preference. Usually it's going to be whole wheat, but whole rye, whole barley, combinations of those. And then there are what you might call artisanal breads that bring in additional grains, sometimes triticale, sometimes amaranth. You do want to be careful, because sometimes marketing hype gets way ahead of the science. And so you can have something marketed as a multi-grain bread, but spoiler alert, it's not multi-whole grain. And the word whole is really important. So if they really are whole grain wheat, different varieties of wheat, whole grain barley, whole grain rye, and whole grain oats, all really good. And they're breads that combine these and sometimes add seeds and so forth. And they're great. And if you travel in Europe at all, in Germany, Austria, they specialize in these energy breads, which are just packed with whole grains and nuts and seeds. And they're really wonderful and very filling. Unlike a white bread, which is easy to overeat, because of the high fiber content of these whole grain breads, they fill you up. So they have a lot of nutrition, they have beneficial fiber, they fill you up on relatively few calories. So all bread is not created equal. I think that's the bottom line here.
I think this is going to be a great message for many people out there, Dr. Katz, who may have broken with bread and broken their hearts in the process.
Right, well said.
We've looked at, you've painted a comprehensive picture of what a good diet should look like. One thing is that it seems almost vegetarian, and I know there's many people out there who would struggle if they had to give up meat, especially even if they have to give up seafood as a last resort. What would you say to these people?
Well, for one thing, it's a reason why I've been a fan of plant-based meats and essentially alternatives to eating factory farmed animals. Because there are people who really like meat as a part of their diet. It's going to be very hard for them to give up. But if they could have an option that is less prone to impose cruelty or abuse on our fellow creatures, they'd probably say, well, sure, that's a good thing. If they could have an option that tastes just as good and is less harmful to the planet, the climate, the Amazon, I imagine they'd say, well, sure, if it tastes as good and I can afford it and it's available, why not? So I like the alternative. But I'm not saying anything dogmatic. In fact, if I rewind just a few minutes ago, I said the one thing that should not be on anybody's menu is dogma. So is it a good thing for us individually, our families, the people we love, our health, our longevity, our vitality, to eat mostly plants? Yeah. Is it also better for our fellow creatures? Yeah. And is it better for the planet? Yeah. But whether mostly plants means you eat some meat because you like it or not, it's up to you. Whether mostly plants means you eat some poultry or not is up to you. Fish or seafood, similarly. So if all of us move in the direction of mostly plants as far as we're willing to go, because I'm not the boss of you, you're the boss of you, right? So I can tell you what's what, but I can't tell you what to do. So don't think about giving up something you don't want to give up. Think about moving in a direction that's good for you just because it is. I'm not making this up. As far as you're willing to go, you're the boss, right? And you have those choices. So, if you wanted a flexitarian diet where sometimes you can eat meat and sometimes you can eat poultry and sometimes you eat fish and seafood and sometimes you have dairy and sometimes you have eggs, that's entirely up to you. If you have a different attitude about diet and say, well, I really don't like eating meat, but I really do like eating poultry, then this sometimes just becomes the poultry. Or if it's fish and seafood, you're a pescatarian, right? So there are all these different options. So, as we were talking about before, Brendan, there are these fundamentals of a healthy diet. And so, yeah, the emphasis would be on eating mostly plants. It just so happens it is kinder and gentler to our fellow creatures and better for the planet too. And I'll give you a quick aside that I think is really important. So I love eating fish and seafood, and it used to be a routine part of my diet. And I eat it quite rarely now. So I'm not a strict vegan, although I'm vegan much of the time. But I occasionally have fish and seafood. But the reason that
your particular taste there?
My particular taste, well, I certainly love wild salmon, and I like mollusks, so mussels, clams. My wife has some recipes with those. But here's the thing. Eating wild salmon may be good for me. It's not so good for the salmon. And you could say, well, that's not my problem. But the thing is, the world is running out of them. And then it's everybody's problem because, we're not going to have them anymore. And the wildlife that is sustained by them, not going to have them. Imagine those magnificent grizzly bears in the Alaska all going away because we ate up the last wild salmon and they all starved to death. I mean, those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Imagine depleting the oceans of fish, which is what we're doing. So I actually started thinking, eating fish may be good for me, but it's bad for the fish. And in an age where we're depleting major fisheries in the world's oceans, I have to care about that. And so I do. So again, I'm not the boss of you. The decisions are yours to make, but they should be informed decisions. And this is the reality we're all living. We didn't ask to be living at a time when there are 8 billion of us. We didn't ask to be living at a time when every decision we make about what we eat has implications for the health of the planet. But here we are, right? We have to accept what fate has dealt us. So less is good. And how far you go in the direction of less is entirely up to you. We do know that for those of you who are willing to be vegetarian or vegan and give up animal food altogether, as long as you maintain a balanced assembly of plant foods, you can have absolutely optimal nutrition, optimal intake of protein, everything you need. And in one of the world's 5 blue zones, there's a large vegan population. They routinely live to be 100. They don't get chronic disease. They don't get dementia. So we have all the evidence we need.
That's the Seventh-day Adventist community.
In Loma Linda, California. Exactly right, Brendan. Thank you. Yeah, you've clearly done your homework before this conversation. So
I've read your book to some degree, Dr. Katz. Yeah. I think it's a great message. I mean, there's plenty of, either way, it's your choice, but there are deeper considerations to what we're putting into our mouth, and that go beyond just our immediate surroundings.
Exactly.
We're going to get the lowdown on meat in just a moment from Dr. Katz, but first, he has co-authored a fantastic book called How to Eat Your Food and Diet Questions Answered, and now you can get a copy at 25% off. The shipping is also free. Just click the link in the description and use the coupon code KATZ25 to take advantage of this offer.
Nice.
This book really is a user-friendly, step-by-step guide to the essential aspects of diet. So I really suggest you check it out. This is what I've been reading. I'm finding it very helpful.
Thank you, Brandon. Well, a quick shout out to my co-author, whom I'm sure many of you know, the great Mark Bittman, who wrote How to Cook Everything, among other things, New York Times columnist for many years. It was really a privilege to work on this book with Mark.
I hope you're enjoying this very first Vital Signs Live broadcast. Vital Signs has new interviews with health experts each week, and you can follow me at Vital Signs Brendan on Instagram and see Vital Signs on X for notice of new videos. Now, Dr. Katz, I want to go a little bit more into meat and going more into fish as well with you. I hear that eating more fish for lean protein can be healthy, but I also hear that there's a lot of potential danger with toxicity like mercury. How much of an issue is this?
Well, so two quick comments about fish. In addition to what I've already said, which is eating fish may or may not be good for us, but it's clearly not good for the fish. So I have colleagues who are very adamant about a vegan diet being best, who say eating fish is not good. We have evidence that it increases inflammatory markers. We have evidence that it is harmful to the microbiome. And of course, you're exposing yourself to toxins that are in the oceans, everything from microplastics to various chemicals to heavy metals. In general, the epidemiologic research, that would be research looking at outcomes in whole populations of people, says eating fish is a good thing. But let's be careful, because those population studies are not comparing eating fish to an optimal vegetarian or vegan diet. That hasn't been done. They're comparing eating fish to what most other people are doing. So, for example, in the States, most people eat relatively little fish, but they eat lots of hamburgers and hot dogs. So people who eat more fish, what is the fish replacing? Generally, it's hamburgers and hot dogs and bacon and pepperoni. So all you need for fish to look really good is for it to be better than that. Is it better than that? Yes, it is better than that. It's better than that than beef and eating mammals. It's better for the planet and it's better for your health. But you're right. Once again, we have that issue of contaminants. And so fish do concentrate the toxins that we've put in their environment, in the oceans, in the lakes, in the rivers. So there's exposure to microplastics, there's exposure to various industrial chemicals, and there's exposure to heavy metal. Those exposures go up with the size of the fish. And that's a phenomenon called bioconcentration. So small fish mostly eat plants or plankton or tiny crustaceans, and they have a limited exposure to those toxins. Larger fish eat the smaller fish and concentrate the toxins in them. And really large fish, swordfish, big tuna, eat the larger fish and are supreme bioconcentrators. So we're really concerned, for example, with mercury levels in swordfish because they're large predatory fish and they concentrate what they're exposed to. So there actually is a prevailing recommendation to avoid swordfish in pregnancy because mercury can cause genetic defects and developmental defects. And the levels in big predatory fish are enough of a concern that there's a recommendation to steer clear of fish like swordfish, especially during pregnancy. In general, though, for people who are inclined to eat fish, keeping in mind that when we talk about a health benefit from fish, it's as compared to what most people are eating otherwise, hamburgers and hot dogs. Those benefits are seen even despite the exposure to toxins. So it's very much like the question you asked just a little while ago, Brendan, about produce. Are we better off avoiding fruits and vegetables because there might be a pesticide or herbicide residue? Definitely not. We get a net benefit from eating fruits and vegetables, even in this world where, unfortunately, we've contaminated them to some extent. The same is true of fish. We see the net benefit of eating fish instead of quite so much meat and processed meat, even despite those toxic exposures. You can turn to an organization called Seafood Watch, both to find out how best to source your fish and avoid toxic exposures based on water quality issues, the size of the fish, and so forth. And also, if you care about this, and I hope you do, sustainability, because at different times, certain fisheries are very much in peril and then they need time to recover, right? I mean, the way you restore a fishery is leave the fish alone so they can reproduce and make more fish, and then the population will recover. So we need to be aware of the status of a fishery to know, is this a fish I can eat right now or should I not? And Seafood Watch is a great resource for anybody interested in all of those issues.
That sounds like a fantastic resource, Dr. Katz. And a way to dispel some of the fear that people might have if they do want to go ahead and still indulge in some fish. With taking it to white meat in particular, well, a lot of people will lean towards white meat because of concern about eating red meat and and cancer risk. Is is red meat more of a cancer risk than white meat? And it doesn't matter if whether it's grass-fed or not.
Yeah, well, so the color really isn't the critical issue. Um, I think we're probably talking about beef as its own category, in particular with regard to environmental impact, but maybe health effects too. And then pork arguably is a white meat, but I think most people when they talk about white meat, they're talking about poultry. So we kind of have the meat of land animals, mammals, and then we have poultry, the meat that people eat from birds and fowl. There is a difference there. So in general, slightly lower saturated fat exposure, slightly better health profile, slightly with poultry as opposed to mammals. The biggest issue is red meat, so beef really, and processed meat. And so processed meat would be deli meats, would be bacon, would be pepperoni. Again, this isn't just meat. This is meat with added chemical compounds to enhance the flavor, to smoke and cure it so it's shelf stable, like beef jerky. And those compounds have been identified as carcinogens. Your question was specifically about cancer. So tops on the list, if the concern is cancer risk, would be processed meat. So we're back in that space we were in a little while ago, talking about what is real food, just a single ingredient. So if you're going to eat meat, don't eat highly processed meat. Eat meat where the only ingredient in your beef is beef and the only ingredient in your chicken is chicken. And be careful about the deli counter, bologna and salami and pastrami and all those things. They're not just meat. They're meat with added fat from animals and added chemicals. And again, some of those chemicals, nitrates and nitrites, have specifically been implicated as carcinogenic.
And it's deceptive because it just looks like meat. You wouldn't. I'm surprised to hear that there's such a chemical factor there involved in some of these things that we all eat, or many of us eat.
And of course, that's true. You could easily be deceived, but on the other hand, when you taste it, if you think about just the times you've had a steak and not put anything on it and just tasted the steak, that's not at all what kielbasa tastes like. That's not at all what salami tastes like. That's not at all what bacon tastes like. So you can tell something's been done to this meat to change the way it tastes. And the more that's done to change the way it tastes, chances are the more has been done to change its effects on your health, and usually not for the better. So if you're going to eat meat, pure meat is the way to go. And then your question about grass-fed, does it make a difference? Yes, but small. So if you analyze the composition of grass-fed cattle as compared to grain-fed cattle, and typically there's a reliance on grain feeding at these big factory farms where they're not pasture raised, you actually do see slightly lower concentration of saturated fat, which is the kind we're all concerned about in grass-fed beef. And because there is omega-3 fat in grass at very low levels, you actually see a little bit, just measurable level of omega-3 fat in the flesh of grass-fed beef. Modest differences. And it's important to note how far all of this is from the kind of meat our Stone Age ancestors ate, something we talked about a little while ago. But let me give you a quick for instance. So if you read the literature on Paleolithic nutrition, written by the leading experts who've done the best they can to get evidence from multiple sources. What were the kinds of animals our ancestors had access to and could have eaten? And what do we know about their diets? And what can we infer about the composition of their flesh based on how they relate to animals living in the modern world? The basic conclusion is the kind of meat our ancestors ate was a lot like antelope. So if we compare antelope to beef cattle, the difference is tremendous. It's stark. So you take an average cut of steak from a steer, about 35% of the calories come from fat. So pretty high total fat content, and much of the fat, the majority, is saturated fat, and there's no measurable omega-3. You compare that to an antelope, which is thought to be the kind of flesh that our ancestors would have eaten, the kind we're adapted to. About 7% of the calories come from fat, 1/5 as much, 80% less. I mean, it's a dramatic difference, night and day. Almost none of it saturated, and quite a bit of it is omega-3, fish oil, if you will.
That's a massive difference there.
Massive difference, right? So we have to be careful not to think, hey, we're adapted to eat meat, so all meat is good meat. Absolutely not. So yes, there's some advantage to grass-fed, but it's small. The best the best way to eat meat for those who are inclined to do it would actually be game, which is the closest to the kind of meat we're adapted to. But that's probably a bridge too far for most people. So I would say the message again is to reduce, eat as little meat as you're willing to. You're the boss. And when you do eat meat, steer clear of processed meat. Stick to meat that hasn't been, if you will, adulterated with the addition of chemical compounds.
That's a great insight, Dr. Katz, and some of those points are quite obvious, but I think it's very hard to, with all these different options before us, and just looking back to what people were eating in the past, as you often refer to, we get a pretty good hint about what is healthy for us.
Especially, Brendan, it's true, and again, we're a species, right? So if that's true for every other species, why wouldn't it be true for us? And it is. But it's not just that. When you really want the view from altitude, you really want to understand what is optimal human nutrition. You take everything you can learn from adaptation and the long sweep of the Stone Age and human civilization, and then you add to that everything we know from modern research, randomized controlled trials, other intervention trials, long-term prospective cohort studies, observational epidemiology, and importantly, what we can learn from health outcomes in entire populations over spans of lifetimes and generations, like the blue zones. You're not going to get that from a randomized trial. We don't do randomized trials that last 300 years. So sometimes, the best place to look is what actually happens to people in the real world. If you combine all that evidence and it's all pointing in the same direction, and it is, then you can be really, really confident.
That is the value of those places we call the blue zones, also the fantastic tourist destinations that we mentioned before. Dr. Katz, we're gonna start the live Q&A now. If viewers out there, if you haven't taken the opportunity, you can still click there and submit a question that you might like to ask Dr. Katz. And we'll be starting, and you can just, if you enter the code 18359, that will allow you to submit a question by following that link.
So I'm seeing.
Sorry, we have the first question there.
I'm seeing it shown right up on the screen, Brendan. How to starve cancer cells. You're looking at that one?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, it's a much more challenging question to answer than you might think. There is some evidence actually that starvation in general, that something called CR, or calorie restriction, significantly reduces cancer risk. So there's been an argument in the literature for a long time that if you somehow can meet all of the critical nutrient requirements, but shrink energy intake, calorie intake, roughly a third below what you think somebody would actually need, and hold it there, that you'll increase lifespan, maybe increase it up to 120 years. I'm sure you've heard this. And of course, we don't have 120-year long studies to prove it in humans, but there are indications in studies with other species that this is all true. Insects that live much longer, mice that live much longer, and leaving aside the ethics of animal research, some studies in other apes where they live much longer. And there are many mechanisms, but one is much less metabolic burden on our cells, much less propensity for mutation, much less cancer risk, and so healthier cells, longer lifespan. So there is actually the possibility that starvation per se may starve cancer cells. Here's the difficulty. It's really hard to do, and it's going to starve your healthy cells. So if you're really talking about starving cancer cells, what you'd want to try to do is carefully design a diet that preserves high quality nutrition while limiting total exposure to calories. There is a downside, and that is cancer, once you have it, drives up metabolism and actually increases energy requirements. So a lot of people with cancer lose lean body mass. They don't just lose body fat, they actually lose muscle. And that has an adverse effect on immune system function, which in turn makes it easier for the cancer to progress. So once you have cancer, often what we're worried about is just what can we do to preserve lean body mass? So rather than take up the entire remaining time wrestling with the nuance of your very, very good question, let me simply say it is a very good question. The answer is quite nuanced. But if you're dealing with this, so either cancer prevention, cancer management, cancer recovery, yourself or a loved one, yes, optimizing nutrition can make a difference. Yes, it absolutely can give the upper hand to your healthy cells and be detrimental to the cancer cells, which is what you want. But you probably want to address this at a personal level as opposed to a one size fits all, because the question becomes, first of all, has the cancer affected your sense of taste? So what you're willing to eat has changed. Has the cancer affected your lean body mass? So we have to worry more about building you up than limiting your calorie exposure. We want to be careful not to starve healthy cells, because some of those healthy cells are immune system cells that you need to fight the cancer. It's a very delicate dance. So doable, addressable, but not something where I can give a simple summary answer here.
Okay. Cancer is on the rise. Specifically, what type of diet do you recommend for a cancer diagnosis?
So very closely related question, and probably this was submitted while I was answering the prior one, so you may recognize, sort of answered it partly already. So first of all, we know that the diet I've been talking about all along, so rich in minimally processed whole vegetables, fruits, grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, is associated with lower rates of cancer. So in the blue zones, low rates of cancer along with low rates of all the other chronic diseases. We also know that obesity is a very potent driver of cancer risk, or at least I know that. I don't know that that message is out there quite as well as it should be. And this is from one of the great epidemiologic studies of all time. It's a large cohort study by the American Cancer Society. They've actually followed 1 million people for decades. So just incredible, treasure trove of data about who gets what. And one of the clear signals in that data set is that obesity is a risk factor for almost every cancer. There are a couple of exceptions, but almost every cancer. And sometimes it's a very potent risk factor. And that same healthy diet, lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and water rather than sugar sweetened beverages when thirsty, is associated with a healthy weight, which is in turn associated with less risk of cancer. So an awful lot you can do to avoid cancer in the first place. But the best diet, if you have cancer, really depends on what's going on with your health because of the cancer. And this will vary with the kind of cancer. This will vary with the kind of treatment for the cancer. Are you losing a lot of weight? Has your sense of taste and smell been adversely affected either by the cancer or by chemotherapy, for example? So I really can't give a one size fits all. Ultimately, both before there's any cancer diagnosis and in the recovery phase, an optimally healthy diet is the way to go. When you're right in the thick of it, when you're dealing with an acute cancer and its treatment, it's much more variable because it may be difficult to find exactly how best to give you the critical nutrition you need to withstand the challenges of the treatment. That really should be a personalized decision. So you want to confer with a dietitian, you want to confer with your medical team, do the best you can to hang on to these principles of generally good nutrition and be committed to getting back to them for the long haul. But in that short period when you're really wrestling with the challenge of treatment, you have to adjust the diet to accommodate some of these issues that are particularly difficult.
I see. Some specific considerations may be required there. Maybe this is a particular example where targeted nutrient supplementation might be needed.
It may very well, and meal replacement, and there's some there's some excellent meal replacement products that are clean and plant-based, and so that there are lots of good options. But even there, it's challenging, Brendan, because sometimes nutrients we know are really good for us, antioxidants, for example. If you take high dose antioxidants while getting, say, chemotherapy or radiation therapy, they're good for your healthy cells, but they actually might protect the cancer cell from the treatment that you want to kill the cancer cell. So even there, it's challenging. So again, as a physician who's taking care of patients with cancer, the honest answer is general principles are important, but it's very subtle. It has to be individualized.
Right. Okay. Our next question is, can a hypothyroid condition be reversed?
Yeah, well, certainly if hypothyroidism is due to iodine deficiency. So, we're talking mostly about nutrition. Iodine deficiency leads to overgrowth of the thyroid gland, or goiter, and underfunction of the gland, because the thyroid gland uses iodine to create thyroid hormone, which is one of the master regulators of all human metabolism. So if you're hypothyroid because you're iodine deficient and you get enough iodine, hypothyroidism will go away. a lot of hypothyroidism in the United States is due to autoimmune disease. And yes, that can get better with time, and nutrition and lifestyle can help there too, because imbalances in diet contribute to imbalances in the immune system. And that contributes in turn to autoimmune disease, where the immune system is essentially overactive and attacks healthy cells, including cells of the thyroid gland. So generally good nutrition, generally healthy lifestyle, routine physical activity, can it make a difference? Can it help deal with hypothyroidism? Sure. In the acute phase of hypothyroidism, if it's due to an autoimmune disease, if it's due to dysfunction of the gland, you're going to want to replace thyroid hormone. And that can safely be done, and the levels can be monitored, so that while you're dealing with hypothyroidism, you don't have to be dealing with the consequences of hypothyroidism, which can be quite unpleasant. But yes, you can recover from hypothyroidism. As you might expect, the critical consideration is what's causing the hypothyroidism. So the first order of business for your doctor would be to figure out what we call the etiology, the origins, the cause of the hypothyroidism. And then based on that, you can map out a plan for recovery.
Okay. Something to put to your doctor if he's not looking into that in the case of your hypothyroidism. Next question. What healthy diet for gluten-sensitive people would you suggest that isn't all carbs?
Well, honestly, no healthy diet is all carbs, because in order to have a healthy, balanced diet, we obviously need protein. Protein is an essential nutrient, right? They're essential amino acids, meaning these are building blocks of critical components of the body: cell membranes, enzymes, hormones, stuff we need. And you can only build them if you have the construction material. And our body can't make essential amino acids. That's what makes them essential. So we have to consume protein. We also have to consume fat. Same reason. Essential building blocks of critical components of a healthy working body. So they're essential amino acids, they're essential fatty acids. So no healthy diet is all carbohydrate. But there's a lot of carbohydrate in most healthy diets, because all plants are a rich source of carbohydrate, but not gluten. So gluten comes principally from varieties of wheat, barley, and some oats. That's where most of it comes from. So how to have a healthy diet that is gluten-free because you're gluten sensitive without leaning too heavily on carbohydrate? Well, first of all, if gluten is your concern, you don't have to worry about carbohydrate in general. And I don't, as I said before, I don't particularly like talking about carbohydrate because most people don't understand it. Saying, carbohydrate's bad is like saying weather is bad. Well, great weather's not bad, right? So same thing. I mean, lentils are carbohydrate and they're great. Lollipops are carbohydrate, not so much. So, we ought to be talking about foods. But if gluten sensitivity is your concern, you need to avoid wheat, you need to avoid barley, and you need to be careful with oats. You can get oats that are certified as gluten-free. And the main issue there is the processing, whether they're processed on an equipment that's also used for other grains. But if not, you can certainly get oats that are gluten-free. But then there are many other grains and grain-like seeds, like there's farro, there's amaranth, there's triticale, there's rye. Quinoa is a seed, but really great nutritional properties and perfectly usable as a grain substitute. Rice, all varieties of rice, so brown rice, black rice, that are naturally gluten-free. And so if you do want carbohydrate in your diet and you're looking for something to replace the bread and the pasta and the cooking grains and the cereals that you can't eat because you're avoiding gluten, you have all those options. And these days, because our food supply is so expansive and so aware of these various food sensitivities, allergies, and intolerances, it's easier than it used to be to shop for, I want gluten-free alternatives. There are lots of them. But if you're looking to minimize your exposure to gluten and carbohydrate, well, then you're going to be eating healthy foods that are particularly high in protein and fat. And so, that's still true to some extent of beans and lentils, very high in protein. Nuts and seeds are high in healthy fats. And then presumably you're talking about a mixed diet, not a plant exclusive diet. So you would want to be eating healthy fish or seafood or lean meats, and choosing carefully among dairy products and deciding whether or not to include eggs. But lots of options, obviously, to have a diet that's still high in quality and avoids exposure to gluten. The final message here, Brendan, not to the person asking this, but to everybody else, is that if you're not sensitive to gluten, there's no reason to avoid it. So gluten either causes you harm because you don't tolerate it, or it doesn't. And the other thing to note is, as I said about bread in general earlier, gluten has been part of the human diet for at least 15,000 years, maybe much longer, because there are indications in some archaeological sites going back 150,000 years that grains were part of the human diet, even in the Stone Age. But certainly for 15,000 years. And the problems with gluten have really become acute only in the modern era. And that's probably not just because of gluten, it's probably because of other things we're doing to the food supply that are disrupting the microbiome. So no need to avoid gluten just on general principles. If it bothers you, you want to avoid it. Obviously, if you have gluten antibodies, if you have celiac disease, you need to avoid it. Everybody else, it's not something to worry about.
Don't run from bread if you don't have to. Let's have a look at the next question.
It's a good summary.
Is sourdough bread nutritious?
Certainly can be. The sourdough starter functions kind of like active cultures in a yogurt, and so has the potential to contribute to the microbiome. And it acts on the simple starches in the bread, and essentially ferments them a little bit. And so that converts them in a way where they have less of an effect on blood sugar and blood insulin levels. But sourdough bread can be made from refined white flour or from whole grain flour. So if you combine the sourdough starter with whole grain, definitely more nutritious.
That sounds like a very tasty combination.
Yeah.
Okay. What's our next question? Can type 2 diabetes be reversed?
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, in medicine, there's no answer that is universally true. So to some extent, it depends how long have you had it. So for those who don't know, the difference between what we now call type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and by the way, we used to call them juvenile onset and adult onset because kids didn't used to get type 2 diabetes. Don't get me started. That's a story that gets me pretty worked up because we've done this to our children. But the difference is that in type 1 diabetes, you have antibodies to the insulin producing cells in the pancreas, and your pancreas can't make insulin. In type 2 diabetes, your pancreas was making insulin fine, but you usually develop obesity, you have fat infiltration of the liver, it interferes with the action of insulin, you need more and more insulin to get the job done. Ultimately, it's too much of a demand on the pancreas, and the pancreas poops out. It just can't keep up with the demand. So if you catch that early and you reverse engineer the process, so you lose weight, you reduce your demands on insulin, your pancreas has had a little time to recover, you haven't completely cooked those cells. They're called the islets of Langerhans, the cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. And the beta cells there that are insulin producing recover. And now you need less insulin anyway to keep a healthy blood sugar, and you've reversed type 2 diabetes. If you've had type 2 diabetes for a decade or longer, sometimes the damage done to those insulin producing cells is permanent. So there isn't a one size fits all answer, but in general, yes, you can reverse type 2 diabetes. And essentially all it takes is a healthy diet, routine physical activity, some degree of weight loss as a byproduct of doing those things right. And the evidence is very clear in the literature. So as a past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, we celebrate very clear evidence that if you use diet and lifestyle as your medicine, and have type 2 diabetes, you can make it go away. I wouldn't, you don't want to assume that you've done that. So you have to coordinate with if you're on medication for type 2 diabetes, you don't suddenly stop, right? But you absolutely can talk about de-prescribing medication. So I'm focusing on diet, I'm focusing on being active every day, I'm losing weight. I want you to monitor my blood sugar very carefully because I don't think I'm going to need this medication for much longer. Absolutely. Go for it.
Makes a lot of sense. A very hopeful message as well there, Dr. Katz, for people who might think there is no hope in that type 2 diabetes situation. Next question, best ways to kick the sugar cravings, and is all sugar bad?
Well, all sugar is sugar, and the only real distinction to make there is added sugar versus intrinsic sugar. So let's talk about whole fruit. Whole fruit has fructose in it. I don't consider that bad. It's intrinsic sugar. And yes, it's still sugar, but it is part of a whole food. And the fruit that's delivering fructose is also almost always delivering a high dose of fiber. The net effect of eating more fruit is less obesity, less diabetes, not more. So we really do need to be looking at the level of the entire food. But in the case of processed food, there's added sugar, and it's not coming generally with fiber. So sugar sweetened beverages, sugar sweetened breakfast cereals, and on it goes. And yes, all that's bad. And it doesn't matter whether it's sucrose or invert sugar or high fructose corn syrup or any of the other many names that are used to conceal added sugar, cane sugar. It's all just sugar and pretty much the same effects on human health. And the best ways to kick the habit sort of depend on you and what you're willing to do. You know, you can focus on just a wholesale dietary overhaul and fix everything all at once. That's really hard for most people. What worked best for my patients over the years is essentially something I call taste bud rehab. And the quick summary is taste buds are adaptable little fellas. When they are with foods, they learn to love them. And when they can't be with the foods they've learned to love, they learn to love the new foods they're with. It just takes a little time. So taste bud rehab is the idea that if you're exposed to very high levels of sugar all the time, that's what you prefer because it's familiar. And if you suddenly change all that, everything's going to taste too dull. Same with salt. If you dial it down incrementally, starting with the foods you care least about, you can reduce your exposure and heighten your sensitivity, and then reduce your exposure some more and heighten your sensitivity. And with a few steps into that process, all of a sudden the dessert or the soda that you used to love actually tastes too sweet. You don't like it anymore. When you don't like something, it's easy to give it up. So I would start with what I call stealth sugar. That's sugar added to foods that aren't supposed to be sugar sweetened in the first place. That would be pasta sauces. Believe it or not, there are commercial marinara sauces in every supermarket in America that have more added sugar than anything in the dessert aisle, than ice cream topping. I would focus on breakfast cereals. Kids cereals are notoriously high in added sugar. Salad dressings. Things in the salty snack aisle often have added sugar. Spreads, even breads and crackers. All those places sugar is being added where you didn't even know it was there in the first place. Stealth sugar. Get rid of that. Swap those items out. Don't buy marinara sauce with added sugar. Look at the label. Find one that costs the same, tastes good, and doesn't have added sugar. That one instead. Same with salad dressing. Same with all those other foods. Believe it or not, that's enough to make a difference. So that's your project for the first couple of weeks. And at that point, you're exposed to many fewer grams of sugar every day, and your taste buds are a little bit more sensitive. Then you move on to foods where you were more aware of the sugar. And again, after just a few steps like that, suddenly you're saying, I don't really enjoy this soda as much as I used to. It really tastes too sweet. I can't eat a lot of the things, and certainly can't drink a lot of things that Americans typically eat and drink. And not because I'm special, not because I'm virtuous, but just because I practice what I preach. And so I'm much more sensitive to sugar. Most things that most people in our country eat are too sweet for my palate. And I've had that experience where I've helped patients make that transition. And the beauty of this is if you're patient and give your taste buds time to adjust, you don't wind up eating stuff just because it's good for you, even though you don't like the way it tastes. You like the way it tastes. You prefer it. You get to love the food that loves you back. And that's the sweet spot.
Okay, so you can dial that addiction back, and you don't necessarily have to go cold turkey. You can do it in an incremental fashion with the foods that have sugar you didn't even know about in the first place. Okay, let's have the next question. Is real butter really bad for you?
Probably not good. But one of the important considerations when we ask good or bad about a food is instead of what? Is it the worst thing you can eat? No. We know, for example, that the saturated fat in something like butter is actually not nearly as bad for us as the trans fat we used to put in margarine. Thankfully, it's gone now, but that was worse, right? So if you're saying which is better, stick margarine or butter, butter would be better. But if you compare butter to, say, extra virgin olive oil as the alternative for cooking or to put on bread, if you're having bread, extra virgin olive oil actually is good for health. There's no evidence that butter is good for health. So is it less bad than some other things? Sure. And that's a critical consideration. So in some ways, my best answer to your question is another question you always want to think to ask, and that is, instead of what? Or in addition to what, right? I mean, if you're having butter on bread and it's white bread, well, now you have the liabilities of the butter, which is high in saturated fat, and the liabilities of the white bread, which is refined carbohydrate. Neither is good. And you've combined them, and either one could be an excuse to eat more of the other. Not so good, right? If we were back in the era when stick margarine was around, you were replacing stick margarine with butter, you'd be trading up, and I'd be saying, good, it's a good start. You've improved your diet. If you are accustomed to putting extra virgin olive oil on whole grain bread and you're asking, is butter just as good? No. Clear evidence that extra virgin olive oil is good for health overall, is good for the cardiovascular system specifically, net benefit, no such evidence for butter. So is it bad? Instead of what? That's really the key consideration.
At risk of taking some of our audience's question time, I think this is a question they will want probably to ask. Just a snapshot, Dr. Katz, how do we know that it's the right extra virgin olive oil? How do we know it's the real deal?
Good question. I don't know any guaranteed way around marketing deception. So if someone tells us it's extra virgin olive oil, they're lying. Then the system has let us down, because obviously we expect regulation of the food supply to at least give us basic honesty on a package. On the other hand, when you're really consuming high quality extra virgin olive oil, you feel it in the back of your palate. There's a compound. It's an antioxidant that is concentrated in the unripe olives that are used. So they're harvested early to make the extra virgin olive oil. They're cold pressed, and this compound called oleocanthal is preserved. And it's a slight tickle in the back of the throat. May even make you feel for just a second as if you need to cough. Usually it's not quite potent enough to make you cough. When you feel that, you know for sure you're getting the real deal. There's also typically a pungent flavor. Olive is a kind of fruit, and when you cold press the olives and harvest them early, which is what happens with extra virgin olive oil, and there are no chemical processes are used to extract the oil, you preserve that sort of pungent, almost fruit-like flavor. So it's usually more flavorful, usually more colorful, slight tickle in the back of the throat, and obviously the bottle should say extra virgin olive oil. I think the simple thing, Brendan, is once you find a product that you do trust, you stick with it. Essentially be a loyal customer. The other way much of the time that you're getting extra virgin olive oil is you're paying a premium for it. It's pretty expensive stuff. It's great,
sure enough.
But you definitely pay for what you get.
That's true. So true in many aspects of life. What's the next question? What are the 5 top supplements healthy people over 65 should be taking?
If you're eating only plants or mostly plants, vitamin B12 could be important. Vitamin D is very important. Zinc maybe belongs on the list. Calcium could belong on the list, especially for women. I think more and more there's a good argument. It's not really a nutrient supplement, but probiotic, because so many of us have harms to our microbiome for so many different reasons. And probably an omega-3, because unless you eat a lot of fatty fish, and there are reasons why you shouldn't be eating a lot of fatty fish, you're probably not getting enough high quality omega-3. That would be my short list. Just quickly, these days I'm an entrepreneur. I founded a company where we do dietary assessment, and we can assess what your intake of nutrients is from foods in about a minute. And I think that's the best answer. Once you get beyond some recommendations that, most people are going to benefit from taking vitamin D or omega-3, once you get past that very short list, we really ought to know supplemental to what, right? I mean, if we're supplementing, it ought to be supplemental to something. And the something is the nutrients you're getting from your diet. And that varies. So we really ought to know what nutrients people are getting from food. And then we can individualize, okay, so you're not getting enough of this, and this would be a place where a supplement could help. Maybe you want to make some adjustments to your diet too, but I think we should be individualizing supplements. But that would be a short list that's pretty generalizable.
That sounds like a really great roundup. I see the supplements that you mentioned coming through again and again when I'm talking to doctors about nutrition. And your enterprise diet ID that you mentioned, will add a link in the description so that viewers can find out more about that, where you can get a pretty good idea of what specifically you are lacking in your diet, and then take the steps to supplement that as you need.
And just to mention, Brendan, because I think we set this up, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're Diet ID and our parent company, we're what's called a B2B company. In other words, we license to health systems and populations rather than individuals. But I think we have a special opportunity for people watching us today to do the dietary assessment. So I think if they follow the link you're sharing, they have a special passcode they can use. So you can actually do an assessment of your diet and see what your nutrient intake levels are. It takes as little as a minute, generally not more than 3. It's easy and even fun. So if I'm correct that you have a special link, by all means take advantage of that.
Okay. Viewers can look for the link to Diet ID in the description. And do we have another question? Long one. How does intermittent fasting fit with Diet ID? I was affected by unknown, Diet ID being the enterprise we were just talking about, where you can analyze exactly what you're eating and find out what's lacking. I was affected by unknown ideology of urticaria.
Urticaria. That's supposed to be urticaria. Yeah,
Urticaria.
I'll take over, Brendan. I can see the
Thank you for
question. So after a 3-day fast, I have no more hives. Good. I'm glad to hear it. Reduce the amount of antihistamines by more than 75%. Have you heard of this? Yes. So urticaria is a systemic allergic reaction. It's hives. It can be brought about by a whole range of things that stimulate the immune system, and then it can be propagated, either caused by or propagated by dietary exposures. So that's what was happening. So maybe it was a dietary exposure that triggered it in the first place in you, or maybe once your immune system was hyperstimulated, everything inflammatory in your diet was just making it worse. And so the fasting just sort of cut it off at the pass, right? So yes, I've heard of it. Yes, it does make sense. How does intermittent fasting fit in with Diet ID? Well, first of all, Diet ID is a whole new way to assess your diet. So the thing that it does that's completely novel is it can tell you what is your diet type, your diet quality, your nutrient intake levels, and your intake of all the different food groups and servings per day in 60 seconds in an interactive game, essentially, as opposed to writing down everything you eat for a week. So it's just massively faster, massively easier, and the data are completely comprehensive. We actually do use this system to help indicate what you should be eating for your specific health goals. Intermittent fasting is something you can combine with any style of diet. So whether you are vegetarian or have a Mediterranean diet or have a Korean diet or a Mexican diet or a Chinese diet, or pick any diet you like, all intermittent fasting says is some of the time you're not going to eat. So you can sometimes not eat with any diet style. So it fits in perfectly fine with Diet ID. It would just be an overlay. Intermittent fasting isn't about what you eat when you eat, and Diet ID is. Intermittent fasting is, okay, so I'm either going to eat 5 days and not eat 2 every week, or I'm going to eat normally for 3 weeks out of a month, and then that 4th week I'm going to restrict my dietary intake, or I'm going to do time restricted eating where I eat during an 8-hour window every day and don't eat for 16 hours. There are lots of different ways to do this. But if you decide you're doing this, you can combine that as a tactic for weight control and sort of rebooting your system with any dietary pattern. So perfectly compatible. But in your case, you still want to try to figure out, with the help of a health professional, what triggered the urticaria, right? It may or may not have been something in your diet. The diet may have been keeping it going, whether or not that was the initial trigger. But obviously, you'd like to do the best you can to figure out what provoked it in the first place so you can steer clear of that.
Okay. Do we have another question? Can you please discuss some cost-effective EMF, electromagnetic frequency reduction tips?
Honestly, not really. It's not my expertise. I mean, the only thing I can tell you is pretty good evidence that you don't want to put an EMF enabled device right up close to your head. So, you don't want to spend a lot of your time talking on a cell phone like this. I think with all the Bluetooth enabled connectors we have access to these days, very few people do that anymore. Maybe some kids do, but the one area where we have the strongest indications of probable harm, potential increase in brain tumors, for example, is when you take an EMF enabled device like a smartphone and spend hours a day with it right next to your head. So don't do that. But again, that's pretty easily avoidable. Other than that, I mean, if you're asking what should we be doing about the towers, what should we be doing about 5G, is that harmful? There's a lot of debate on that topic, and I could share an opinion, but it's not really my expertise. So I don't think I should say more.
Okay. That's, I guess, one benefit coming through from the Bluetooth technology. Any tips on water filtration for forever chemicals for drinking water and showering?
There too, I would say I probably don't know more than you do. There are filters that claim to be really good at taking everything out down to a very small microscopic level. Brita is the name that comes to mind. And there are a number of companies that make high quality filters. So I think if you're looking for that, if you're concerned, my home, we have well water. We have the quality of the water tested, but it's, it's groundwater from a pretty rural area. I feel pretty good about it. So not really concerned about it here. But if you live in a place where you are, then you can buy a filter that connects directly to your tap, or you can have a filter that is integrated into a container that you then store in your fridge, so you always have cold, very pure drinking water. I would do what we all tend to do when we're shopping for a product. I'd Google what is the best water. I'd look at reviews. I'd do some comparison shopping. I'd look what they cost, look what they claim to filter, look to see whether or not it's been validated, and I would choose accordingly. I've looked at that over time, but again, I'm in a position where I haven't had to worry about it in my own home, so I can't offer a very specific recommendation.
Yeah, one of those areas where you just have to do a lot of research to make sure you're getting the right healthy product. Do we have another question? I've just discovered I have a serious calcium deposit in my heart. What diet will help?
So calcium in the coronaries is an indication that you have atherosclerosis, and a high calcium score does tend to suggest a higher risk of heart attack. We have evidence that diet and lifestyle can shrink that plaque away and dramatically reduce the risk of heart attack. That's been studied with something called the Ornish diet, developed many years ago by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dean Ornish. That is a low-fat, plant-predominant diet. But we have similar evidence for the Mediterranean diet, which is a high-fat, plant-predominant diet. But the high fat in a Mediterranean diet comes from olives, avocado, nuts and seeds, extra virgin olive oil in particular, and to some extent fish and seafood. So it's really the diet we've been talking about all along. It stands to reason that in order to be a healthy human, we need all of our parts to be healthy. And it also stands to reason that if something is making you a healthy human, that it's good for all your parts. So what's good for the liver is good for the kidneys, is good for the spleen, and round we go. So the best diet for a healthy human heart is pretty much the best diet for a healthy human. So the stuff we've been talking about, lots of vegetables, fruits, beans, lentils, nuts and seeds, plain water when thirsty, minimize your intake of saturated fat, animal foods, added salt, added sugar, ultra processed foods. And the difference really when you're dealing with something like a high calcium score versus everybody else is just the urgency. And so I would say, if you were a patient of mine, I'd say I'd be recommending the same diet to you if you didn't have a high calcium score, because it's very likely to protect you from everything and add years to your life and life to your years. But my expectation with you, because you got a scare, you got a test result back that's making you concerned, is you're going to be more eager to hear my advice and more eager to follow. You're going to do a more diligent job, right? You're going to make a more dramatic change in your diet. Somebody who, hey, I'd like to eat well, but I'm perfectly healthy. I'm not too concerned about my health. Tell me what I can try and I'll think about it. That's very different from, I got a test result back. I'm scared. Tell me what to do. You're probably really going to do it. So I would say, look into the Mediterranean diet, look into the Ornish diet. You can find meal plans online. But a number of these have been studied in large randomized controlled trials showing absolutely you can slash your risk of heart disease even after you have the presence of calcium in your coronaries. You can reverse that process. So go for it.
And the Mediterranean diet, I just want to add, is one of the many diets and aspects of good nutrition that is covered in your book, Dr. Katz. That we have a code for that in the description, and a discount of 25% that is available at the moment. And yeah, just bring that up on screen there. Next question: what diet can help with AD? Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, these abbreviations sometimes go in multiple directions. Well, it sort of depends where we are on the spectrum, whether we're talking about preventing dementia or whether we're talking about treating dementia, whether we're talking about optimizing the retention of memory early in the process or restoring brain function. The evidence for effects late in Alzheimer's disease, so when there really is significant cognitive decline, is pretty limited. And that's not surprising because in advanced Alzheimer's, there's actually a distortion to the architecture of the brain. Neurofibrillary tangles, they're called, and plaques. So essentially, the connections among the neurons start to break down. And at that stage, limited evidence that diet or lifestyle could make a difference. But first, let's refer back to evidence we've talked about multiple times in this conversation. They don't tend to get dementia in the blue zones.
Mm.
So they are eating real food, not too much, mostly plants, variations on that theme. They're physically active. They tend not to smoke. They're getting enough sleep. They're not stressed out. They have strong social connections. That six-cylinder engine of lifestyle as medicine clearly protects against dementia as well as everything else because they don't tend to get it. And it's not as if it's genes because these are five very diverse populations that don't have genes in common. They're just like the rest of us. They're just living better. We have similar evidence from many other studies showing that there's preserved cognitive function, enhanced cognitive function with a high quality plant predominant diet. So, very helpful in preventing dementia, very helpful in preserving high quality cognition with the earliest hints of impairment, but not quite where we want to be with the ability to reverse Alzheimer's. So the best hope really is healthy living in advance. And the other thing, even though our emphasis is on nutrition here today, and even though that's what your question is about, the evidence is really very strong that physical activity is one of the best ways to mind our brain. So get up and walk. And if you have a job that has you sitting much of the time, think about a walking desk. I'm up and moving a lot, but my wife has to be sitting at a computer much of the time. She exercises, she goes to the gym, but we were talking about the fact, and there's dementia in the family, and said, you don't want to just exercise and then sit all day and say, I exercise for an hour, I'm all set. No, you actually get tremendous health benefit from moving throughout the day. So she has now a walking desk and is on a treadmill while she's working. And so there's exercise plus movement throughout the day. That combination is gold. So yes, diet's very important. The basic dietary principles as discussed. Physical activity is also important. Brendan, I just want to point out the time, and I'm thinking it's probably about time to wrap this up, unless you think
Sure.
otherwise.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question about diet ID. Dr. Katz, would you like
Sure.
to tackle this one just as a last? Thank you. How will the
Sure.
results of diet ID motivate people to eat better? In other words, how do you plan to help people beyond the results?
What I like to say is that diet ID is to diet as the blood pressure cuff is to blood pressure. So imagine if you were asking that question about blood pressure. How do you expect the results of taking a blood pressure measurement to help people or motivate people? And the answer is it becomes a cue to action that's part of an entire system. So, first of all, you've learned that there is a healthy level of blood pressure. And if your blood pressure is not there, if it's too low or too high, you're concerned about it. That's motivation right there. You say, well, those numbers aren't good. The other thing is that your health professionals, anybody involved in the mission of protecting your health, has the same cue to action. So we link diet ID data to the electronic health record. So your physician can know what your diet quality scores. We're using an objective measure of overall diet quality. It's called the Healthy Eating Index. It's on a 100-point scale. We report it out at 10 points, so deciles. 10th is the best, 1 is the worst, in between is in between. And you can see exactly where you fall on this 10-point scale. And if you're low, you're at increased risk for heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia. So you're going to feel motivation. But there's only so much value in motivation if you're not sure what to do with it. So the next question is, what do I do with it? What should my diet be? I'm concerned about my weight. I'm concerned about my blood pressure. I'm concerned about my heart or diabetes or whatever it may be. Well, we can help you find an optimal goal diet. We can then compare down to the nutrient level what makes up your current diet, what would make up your goal diet. We can also help you shop a range of goal diets to choose the one that looks most appealing to you. And then we can help you get there from here by looking at the specific differences between where you are and where you want to be for optimal health in a way that actually is consistent with how you're willing to eat for a lifetime. So when you add all that information together, the answer is we can do a lot. But again, I really think that where we are with diet now is like where the world was back in the days before the blood pressure cuff was invented. We already knew that blood pressure was really important. We already knew it was a predictor of heart attack or stroke. But since we didn't have a convenient, non-invasive way to measure it, the only way we found out that somebody's blood pressure was broken was when they had a heart attack or stroke. We waited for bad stuff to happen and then said, your blood pressure must be part of the problem. Maybe we should try to fix it. We didn't get ahead of it. That's where we are with diet. We don't routinely measure people's diet quality. We don't get ahead of it. We wait for people to develop obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and maybe then we talk about diet. We want to fix that. We want to get ahead of it. We want to move upstream and empower people to have this actionable information. Here's what your diet is. Here's your diet quality. Here are different ways you could eat that would fix this and much reduce your risk for having health problems down the line. And you can choose among them the one that looks most appealing. And then we can break it down to a sequence of small steps to get you there. And your doctor can have this information, your health coach can have this information, your family can have, anybody else who needs this information to help you get there from here can have this information. So that's how we view it. I really see this as having the potential to change the standard of care and practice the same way the invention and introduction of the blood pressure cuff did. And it's time, because again, diet quality is the single leading predictor of premature death and chronic disease in the modern age. So for far too long, we've gone without this critical information. We manage what we measure. It's time to measure diet quality in everybody.
Dr. Katz, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to answer all these questions from our audience as well. Really, what I really appreciate about you is you have this incredible wealth of research backing up your advice, but you put everything into these digestible, user-friendly packets. And I think that's there in the book that we are promoting today, which is a 25% discount if you want to order that now. Dr. Katz's book with Mark Brittman. And this is done in a very easy to read, user-friendly Q&A style. And I haven't got any questions left after reading this book, so I encourage you to take a look at it.
That's great. Well, Brendan, thanks so much. It was a pleasure being with you today. And I hope I'm not disclosing a secret, but I think this is your first live one of these. So pleasure to be with you on your maiden voyage. You did a great job. I appreciate your kind words.
Yeah.
My
I
pleasure.
had a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Katz. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Be well.